He didn't do this in. Welcome to worship with the Universalist Unitarian Church of Peoria. My name is the Reverend Jennifer Innis. It is my great joy to be the minister with this congregation of people of all ages, at all stages of life. This is a beloved community striving to live into its mission of embracing freedom, loving wholeheartedly, growing in mind, body, and spirit, and adding to the wholeness and the healing of the world. We are unapologetically progressive in welcoming people of all ethnicities and races, sexual orientation and gender identities, social and economic situations and abilities, and politics. We advocate for human rights and we strive to be good stewards of this earth. We also take to heart our connection with the world. This land is the ancestral home of the Peoria people. They and other nations were here long before the first European settlers came down the Illinois River. We honor the Peoria people for who they were and for who they are today. I want to take a moment and extend a very warm welcome to everyone. Well, to everyone, let me just offer the warm because boy, it's cold. Whew, brr, but the coffee is warm. And so is the fellowship. It takes no small effort to venture into an established community if you are visiting us for the first time. Thank you for finding us. See ushers for name tags. We welcome all the questions, and please stay for coffee and conversation after the service. If you are joining us in person, and there's room for conversation in Zoom if you're joining us online as well. And now I invite you to take a moment and just double check that one's devices are in worship mode. Always, always good to check. Of course, if they are medical and you need them to be sounding, that's also fine. I have a few notes for today. One, there is the wonderful concert with the Heritage Ensemble, 3 p.m. today. This is one of our wonderful African American choruses in Peoria, and I really want to encourage folks. There's a poster for this outside the bathroom. Reverend Linda White, who is formerly the assistant minister with this congregation, is one of the major supporters of the Heritage Ensemble. So I really want to encourage folks to go on out and be warmed in spirit there as well. I want to thank everybody who was part of the Finding Your Place in the Resistance workshop yesterday. That workshop ended up following on the People's March organized by Peoria Proud as well. It was yesterday morning in Peoria Heights. It was a balmy 27 yesterday. I'm really glad it was. Okay. And we had a wonderful conversation and effort here. I want to thank Jesse Laughlin again for really great organizing on that and everybody who participated in this as well. This coming Saturday, yet another reason to be warm, is the annual chili cook-off. There is still time to sign up and bring chili. And we welcome the range of chili, even the stuff with beans that Texas would say, But we love all the chili. So come and add some variety as well. Invite your friends and neighbors for some very good food and some very excellent company. And of course, I have to mention that in a few weeks, we are hosting the first ever Valentine's Dinner and Dance on February 14th. We are taking advantage of the fact that Valentine's Day is a Friday and providing a chance for folks to get on out. Everybody is welcome to join. We have, I think, Jesse, do we have childcare for that? Yes, we have childcare for that too. So I want to invite folks to join us as well. And now I invite us to turn to our opening hymn for worship, number 40, The Morning Hangs a Signal. It is in our gray hymnal. Please rise in body or spirit. Be seated. And Jean, would you come forward? I invite Jean Burke for our opening words.
Morning by Reverend Clinton Lee Scott. From the east comes the sun, bringing a new and unspoiled day. It has already circled the earth and looked upon distant lands and faraway peoples. It has passed over mountain ranges and the waters of the seven seas. It has shone upon the laborers in the fields, into the windows of homes and shops and factories. It has beheld proud cities with gleaming towers and also the hovels of the poor. It has been witness to both good and evil, the works of honest people and the conspiracy of knaves. It has seen marching armies, bomb-blasted villages, and the destruction that wasteth at noonday. Now, unsullied in its tireless journey, it comes to us, messenger of the morning, harbinger of a new day.
And I invite the Kaufman family forward for our chalice lighting.
A shared story by Reverend Sandra Fees. For the stories that long to be told and retold, for the stories that long to be imagined and reimagined, for the stories that long to be envisioned and celebrated, we kindle this chalice. May its flame bring the light of different truths, different paths, and different voices, all needed to cultivate a transformative story of justice, love, and beauty.
Shine on me, oh, shine on me. Let the light from the lighthouse shine on me. Shine on me, oh, shine on me. Let the light from the lighthouse shine on me. Let us enter into a time of candles and reflection, a time of music and meditation. And so during our time of music, you are welcome to come forward, light candles before us. If you are joining us online, I invite you to let these candles be for you. Let us enter into our music for meditation. From Israel, Zangwil. Come into the circle of love and justice. Come into the community of mercy, holiness, and health. Come, and you shall know peace and joy. This is the time for the sharing of the joys and sorrows of the congregation. We have a few notes for today. I invite us to offer healing thoughts for Randy Stevens. He has been at OSF for several days. I also want to invite us to offer wishes for peace to Lucy McCrae. She is about to return home and be in hospice care. I want to offer a note that's both local and global, national, that there are some conflicts in our world that have some real impact for our friends and neighbors. You may or may not know that there was the ban on TikTok, the social media app that went into effect last night, midnight Eastern. And that means that there are some people, some of our folks in the congregation, some folks in our community who have a significant loss of their networks, of their community, and including also their income because of what they had created through this app. I don't know what the future will hold, but I want to at least invite us to recognize that this has some direct impact on folks who are right among us, and indeed are us. Also want to recognize in our larger world that the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is taking effect, and that it looks like hostages are being returned to Israel. May the ceasefire continue and continue to lead to a better resolution. Let's hold one more moment of quiet, one more moment of recognizing the names, the milestones, the joys and the sorrows that are among us. Just pause to breathe in this circle of care. Shalom, salam, blessed be. And now I invite Jesse Larkin forward for our story.
For our story today, let's travel back in time. Let's go all the way back to the 1930s. That was an interesting time in the world. It was a time between two world wars. The Great Depression had changed the way that people were able to make money and support their families. The Dust Bowl was changing the land and the way that farmers could grow crops. Prohibition, a law that made it illegal to sell alcohol, had big changes for a city called Peoria, sometimes called Whiskey City. Let's imagine Peoria in 1930. Let's imagine the first Universalist church, our church, in 1930. What could we do with all these changes happening? Well, don't worry. We had answers. In 1930, we were one of the largest universal churches in all the country. Imagine, right here. We were in our second Hamilton Avenue church building. Sometimes we call it the downtown church. It's where our stained glass and our pipe organ came from. Our congregation was big, and we were ready to help. That was also a year that brought us a new minister and his new wife, Clinton Lee Scott and Mary Slaughter Scott. Mary was an active Universalist from Camp Hill, Alabama. Let's learn a little about Mary Scott this morning. In this imagining of her voice that's excerpted and added to from the Women of the South sermon, originally created by Dorothy Emerson and Janet Bowring. I am Mary Slaughter Scott. I was born in the year 1900 in Camp Hill, just a small town in the southeast part of Alabama. When I was growing up, Camp Hill was the largest Universalist church in the South. I remember that we had over 200 in the church school alone. I was an active part of that church, and I probably would have become a Universalist minister had I been born 20 years earlier or 20 years later. As it was, I attended Judson College in Alabama, taught school there for a year, and then prepared at Tufts College to be a religious education director. I hear it's a good job. And then at St. Lawrence to be a minister's assistant. I worked for a year as the director of religious education at the Universalist Church in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and then, to my great joy, became a field worker for the Universalist General Sunday School Association. And in that position, I traveled all over the country, helping local churches with their religious education programs. I married my husband, Clinton Lee Scott, in 1930, and we headed off for Peoria. For a while, Clinton was known as Mary Slaughter's husband, but don't worry, he eventually made his own name for himself. While we were in Peoria, we did lots and lots of good work. I am very proud of the birth control clinic that Clinton and I founded. I worked hard to keep that clinic funded and running. You see, taking care of folks for our whole lives has always been important to UUs. The cooperative grocery store was another great success that we had in Peoria. Clinton and I drove that first load of supplies down from Chicago ourselves, and we watched that store grow out of our church basement into a second location and eventually into its own rented space. That grocery provided food for people at affordable prices when they couldn't get that anywhere else. I was so happy to know that working people could feed their families because of what we had on offer. Eventually, our work took us out of Peoria to Boston and beyond. Clinton and I secured a place for humanism in this faith that we love and believe in, working in movements spreading principles of dignity and worthiness, encouraging change. I myself served on the board of trustees for the Universalist Church, and I worked behind the scenes for years towards the merger with the Unitarian Church. My life was full, and I left a legacy of Unitarian Universalist ministers throughout my family and friends. When I died in 1973, I truly hope that I left this world a better place than when I found it. Wow. Imagine what it would have been like to meet Mary Slaughter Scott. I'm so proud she's part of our legacy here in this church. I wonder what good work she would inspire us to do today. And I wonder how we can keep her memory and bring it forward. The kids and volunteers are invited to join me for religious education. You can help sing them out.
I so appreciate the story of Mary Slaughter Scott and how much she embraced being part of this world and part of service and helping and finding ways to speak really directly to people's lives. It reminds me how much we value as a faith and as a church the ability to say yes, that we give of ourselves so freely and so generously to say yes to the values of our faith, yes to the practice of putting our beliefs into the world. And we do this in so many ways, including giving of our service and our wisdom and our financial generosity to make this congregation happen again and again. And so we take a moment in our service to receive the offering, to support that practice of giving, to encourage that reflection, and to say, yes, we really do something here. And we also send a portion of our financial benefit into the world through our Share of the Plate practice. We send half of the undesignated plate in as an offering to our local organization every month that is doing really good work. And for this month, our Share the Plate recipient is Lula NFP. And we have a bit of a special moment of guests from Lula NFP here to talk about their work. And I wanted to invite Era and Kesha up to speak a little bit about this good work.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. So, Lula was founded in 2020 during COVID, during the pandemic, specifically during the lockdown. I had been doing outreach with Jolt Harm Reduction, which is our local harm reduction org, and had been serving about 10 disabled, unsheltered men that were sleeping under a dock, so they couldn't make it to Sophia's kitchen to get their own lunches. And I pulled up one day during COVID, and there were about 50 people standing in the parking lot crying, saying, "The kitchen is closed. What are we going to do?" And I looked and I said, there is absolutely no way the kitchen is closed. This kitchen serves 400 people a day. Everyone's dependent upon it. But there was a sign written on the door that said the kitchen was in fact closed. If you know me, which most of you don't, but if you ever get to know me, you know I lean towards the action. It's a flaw and an asset. So we started a meal train, and it was all community-based. And we started delivering 150 lunches. We were distributing them from CityLink bus stop because that's where people, especially impoverished and unhoused friends, tend to gather. And out of that grew Lula. That's when I really fell in love with our unsheltered community in Peoria. And that's when I started to build relationships that I maintain to this very day. And through that work, we decided that we needed tents and sleeping bags and all the supplies that you need to sleep as safe as possible while you're outside, while you're experiencing homelessness. There's 3 different types of homelessness. Lula focuses on what they call street unsheltered. So that means you're in doorways, you're in tents, you're in abandoned buildings. We've continued to serve this population that, as we're speaking of bans today, in June, the Supreme Court passed a federal law that said cities had the right to effectively ban people from sleeping outside for survival's sake. You can still do it recreationally, but if you don't have a home to sleep in, then it's illegal. So that they effectively criminalized being impoverished and being without a home. Peoria, there's been a lot of stuff in the news about what's going on. They banned it. And the city council voted to go forward with that ban. So what Lula has done is moved everybody in out of the encampments that you all saw that were along the interstate corridor into what we are calling the Motel Project, Love Your Neighbor. But it's a transitional shelter. So our folks that came in out of those tents, out of those doorways, are now in a transitional shelter with us at a local motel. And we're serving about 61 unsheltered folks. We are a grassroots organization. We are all volunteer and donation based. Until Tuesday, the city council did vote to fund us with the $80,000 through the end of February. Thank you. We are very, very grateful for that, but it is still a big endeavor. It does not cover any sort of staffing at all whatsoever. So we are still doing this all volunteer, and we continue to do street outreach to people who are maybe staying in abandoned homes together. That is their home. So we are supporting them there. I'm still going out and finding people who are unsheltered. While I have great relationships with this community, there are still people sleeping outside. The shelters are past capacity still, including ours. So we continue to serve our most vulnerable and marginalized neighbors. Thank you for all of your support. You can visit our Facebook page, Lula Peoria NFP, or our website. Thank you. Have a good day.
I want to thank you, Kesha, for coming and speaking, and for Tara Wood for being here today. This was an effort that was coordinated. Kathy McNeil, she couldn't be with us today, but she made this effort and this outreach as well. And I also want to offer a couple of notes. One, that they'll be able to stay after the service during coffee hour for some questions and some conversation. I think also have some, do you have some signs? You have some, yep, we have some signs for donation that you can have for a donation as well. And I got a note from Jay Gruber before service. I think there'll also be part of a conversation later this afternoon at the Connection Circle here at 3 o'clock as well. So I really wanted to offer a note. We don't often have a chance for having a guest come and talk directly about a program, and this was such a gift of their time and their attention to us as well. And such an important concern in this moment. And now, I want to thank folks for all the ways in which you support the congregation, for you support the mission and our effort and our living our values in the world. Please use the donation envelopes and indicate where you'd like your donation to go, and also the QR code in the order of service as well. And I want to invite the ushers to please come forward. For our reading today, it comes from the late Reverend Clinton Lee Scott. I offer it in recognition of this weekend and our return to the work, as we do on a regular basis, the return to the work of the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Every chance we have an opportunity to understand better and live the call of Dr. King, and to wonder, how are we doing now? Now, one of the criticisms of how our society has moved forward with Dr. King's work is to focus on him, say, once a year. Like that's enough. Or to pay more attention to the nonviolence and mutuality that he was talking about, and not more deeply recognize the conflict of class and race that he offered, the critique of moderates in our society, and how we let injustice continue without being named and addressed. And so, how are we doing today? Reverend Clinton Lee Scott offered this message about prophets. I want to thank Judith Corin Shanahan for offering the reading today.
Always, it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the directions of their vision. It is easier blindly to venerate the saints than to learn the human quality of their sainthood. It is easier to glorify the heroes of the race than to give weight to their examples. To worship the wise is much easier than to profit by their wisdom. Great leaders are honored not by adulation, but by sharing their insights and values. Grandchildren of those who stoned the prophet might sometimes gather up the stones to build the prophet's monument. Always, it is easier to pay homage to prophets than to heed the direction of their vision.
I invite you to rise in body or spirit for our hymn, We Would Be One, number 318 in the gray hymnal. So I will go out on a limb and say yesterday was a good day in Peoria. Peoria Proud organized the local march and rally as part of a larger national People's March effort. About 170 people came together from groups such as this congregation or individuals who simply were moved and wanted to show up. Lula and FP collected donations of financial help and material help as well to serve the folks impacted by the challenge of securing a safe place to live. We called for human rights over our bodies, our health care, our voting, our education, who we are, how we are, and much more. Speakers include people from a range of concerns, including the Yanni Collective and addressing racism in Peoria. And it was cold, and the collective spirit warmed us and sustained us. And then many of us, this congregation, came along to here with the members, some of the members of the public and the community, to share soup and connect with each other on how we can contribute to resisting fascism, to advocating for rights, to advocating for a more just and more whole world. So I want to thank Jesse Laughlin again for organizing the workshop, Finding Your Place in the Resistance, and for those who brought food, who helped set up and clean up, and who helped us be really good hosts. I have to say, there were about 55 people total who came for the program and 7 children in the childcare. How much the childcare alone was appreciated, because one of our ways that we really need to be able to serve and be active is to say we are living our values and including everybody as much as possible to make this work as accessible as possible, because every one of us has something we can do. So often people wonder what difference one person can make, or that of a congregation or of a march, such as yesterday. There was some criticisms like, you know what, that voting thing, that election thing, that has already happened. The marching should have happened before that. And I'm going to offer that there is no limit to how often we can show up and say, these rights are our rights, and we are human beings, and we deserve to be seen and known, don't we all? That is without season, without time. And with a change in national administration, there are indeed real concerns for rights and for liberty, and even for the opportunity, the privilege of coming together. There was a lot of witnessing and sharing in the work yesterday, and it reminded me yet again of how one of our greatest powers as human beings is that of storytelling, of discovering, rediscovering, remembering, reminding, talking about those efforts of those who came before and found a way when the world was hard. The work is about admiring and learning from past actions and learning from mistakes as well. So I want to take this moment to share a few of those stories, because we do this when we talk about Dr. King, right? Well, this congregation has some of its own accounts. And in that sense, I want to go back just about 100 years. That seems like a nice round number. So in 1930, you have Reverend Clinton Lee Scott and Mary Slaughter Scott. I kind of appreciate this. They got married and went to a new ministry all in the same year. So they took up their ministry, his ministry here. This congregation was the largest Universalist congregation in the country at the time. And its advocacy of welcome and inclusion, and in the language of the time, of God's love as an openness and a presence here as an invitation to free thought and public discourse. I mean, that was magic. That went a long way to attracting people and had been doing so for some time. And the Scots arrived here in the midst of the Great Depression and Prohibition and much social shift. So I want to say a little bit more about the Scots themselves. And if Cullen, you could show the photo. So we have in one of our hallways, we have photos of past ministers and current ministers. And so this is the photo of Clinton Lee Scott and Mary Slaughter Scott. And I would just want to, this is one of the enduring images we have of them. But I want to offer the note that in 1930, Mary Slaughter Scott was 30 years old. She wasn't this. She was this whole other person, and he was this whole other person. Thank you, Cullen. And I would love to know what Mary's voice was like, because she grew up in Camp Hill, Alabama. And I have been to Camp Hill, Alabama. And I want to tell you that the southern drawl there is deep and robust. And yet Mary went up to Tufts University in Massachusetts and had to navigate these East Coast Northerners, Unitarians and Universalists, to get her education, to be respected as an educator. It was no small thing. And Clinton Lee Scott brought his deep perspective and his willingness to speak truth and a respect for the human capacity in religious conversation. Now, I have two short stories about the Scots in this church. Jesse talked about them. So keep in mind, in the 1920s and 1930s, how birth control was just beginning to be more public and a more public and more legal conversation. People were moving beyond attaching a moral stigma against physical intimacy for the sake of joy, and not just have the social context of holding it for reproduction. The first birth control clinics were founded in the mid-1920s, and people wanted advice on how to determine their choices and the size of their families. And the Scots founded a clinic here in Peoria that is part of our church history now. What's also certainly true is how the Depression weighed upon people. I love this idea of Clinton Lee Scott and Mary Slaughter Scott making a road trip to and from Chicago. No highways, right? Oh my goodness. And to bring the first load of food that created the cooperative grocery in the basement of the church in downtown Peoria. And how they made that effort and started that off, and how that was in that basement for some months before finding a permanent home in another location. And there they were, the Scots inspiring the congregation to feed and care and meet people where they were. I mean, that's the essential work of every faith community. I really want to know what those conversations were like 100 years ago, to say this is what we need to do now. And how they persevered amidst the struggle to create these resources, amidst a difficult social context, amidst real financial and economic limitations, even while the congregation was big and energetic and was so much in the ability to say yes. Now, in another moment, so some of those past efforts are not as documented as the ones that are more recent, but I want to turn to another moment, another question of doing the right thing and matters of conscience, and in this case also legality and national conflict. Because one of the most significant moments of that in this congregation's life came during the Vietnam era. Now, our larger denomination, Unitarian Universalism, was the publishing house, Beacon Press, was making the bold move in that era of being the publisher of the Pentagon Papers that documented how President Lyndon Johnson and his administration covertly expanded the conflict in Vietnam without informing the American people. But the biggest, most difficult challenge, it was generally, it was a national experience as well as certainly in our denomination, was the everyday conflict in congregations about the Vietnam War. Many ministers spoke against the military offensive, spoke against violence, spoke against the racial weight of the draft, bringing along people who didn't have the resources to get out. Ministers speaking for peace. Many members of our congregation disagreed or had conflicted feelings. There was also concerns about who could speak for the church and the minister's right to speak the truth as they saw it. And this was happening all over the country, and it happened here. And it happened during the ministry of the Reverend James Wilkes in 1968 into his departure, 1973, 4, I think. The country and the church were already at odds about the Vietnam conflict before Reverend Wilkes arrived. But what brought to the question to a point was about draft counseling. Let me say a little bit more about draft counseling, because this is a story. I'll say some of these stories were ones that we can imagine, and some of these stories are ones that some of you lived through. And I'm going to say I'm of a generation that I did not. This is one that I am still learning as someone here. So in the draft, all men between the ages of 18 and 26 were required to register for military service. 2.2 million young men were, in fact, drafted during the Vietnam era. And so many of them came from working class or lower income families, people who could not take so much advantage of legal ways to avoid being drafted, to enroll in college, for example, and were not so likely to receive good advice about how to be within the law and still not be drafted. And so to help young men explore their options, understand their options, you had draft counseling organized by groups such as the American Friends Service Committee. You had attorneys offering their advice as well. And it was legal as long as it's offered in a neutral, factual way, not advocating draft evasion. So Reverend Wilkes and the leaders discussed the request to host draft counseling at the church. It was an outside group wanting to use the church space. The Peoria Area Peace Committee, I believe. But there was a deep concern that the PAPC was not entirely nonviolent, that they advocated for a certain level of confrontation. And that was a lot at the core of the conflict. So one of the questions was whether granting the use of the building to a group was endorsement of that group, for example. There was communication and misinformation and fears of going against the law, and those were at the center of hours spent in meetings. All right, so sometimes the board meeting goes a little long, but I'm going to say it doesn't go to midnight. Not here, thank goodness. But this is what they were spending their time with. They were so struggling with this question. There was board discussion, there was messages in the newsletter. The minister and the people were trying to find a way and were fully, imperfectly human in the process. You had longtime members resign, you had membership drop. Leaders in the congregation eventually were able to agree that counseling could happen on Saturday afternoons, and this started in 1969. Not too long, it didn't take too long before the counseling moved to another location so it could happen on a full-time basis. And leaders also affirmed that the minister has a public voice of their own. But the conflict wounded the congregation, and that hurt contributed, I think, to the financial crisis that happened shortly afterward. And it also made the congregation very cautious about how to be a voice in the future. What is also true is how service and public action is part of the central tasks of a religious community: worship, fellowship, education, service. There is a point at which we, even being wounded and even having such a hard time with such a deep conflict, there's still places where we just can't help but want to help. And so over time, and with the smaller efforts that every religious community does, the congregation found ways to move past the lasting hurt of the Vietnam years and to serve our human concerns in public ways. And I want to offer just a couple. The congregation, if you look on the website, the congregation completed what's called the Welcoming Congregation Process, was recognized for that with the UUA, our Unitarian Universalist Association, in 2004. That is the process, the formal process of classes and conversation and a congregational vote of a congregation saying we are actively, intentionally welcoming to folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex, asexual. That is one of the ways that the congregation can formally affirm its commitment and be public. And it's actually the way, partially, how we can keep going with that message. It's not something we have to vote on again and again. We have done that vote. We can affirm it, and we need to kind of affirm that work, but we can continue with that, and we do going forward. I also want to note, again, related to the conversation from the real hardship and fear coming out of the conflict in the Vietnam era. One of the ways the congregation has found a way to have a voice is in 2011, it started the process of having specific issues connected to organizing groups and approved by the congregation. It's what our fall congregational meeting business is we take the proposals from the Social Impact Committee and hopefully vote them into action. Now, last fall, the congregation approved the work against the CO2 pipelines and the hazardous environmental and human impact of the CO2 pipeline efforts. Congregation approved continuing the work in racial justice with the Faith Coalition for Racial Equity that was formed in 2020 in response to George Floyd's murder at the hands of police. That racial reckoning of 2020 also led to the addition of the Black Lives Matter sign out front and an ongoing commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism. And one of the things that's still forming as a specific goal, but we're living that in spirit, is to address homelessness in Peoria. And it's so good that we were able to bring Lula in today to be part of the efforts to speak against the ordinance that criminalizes camping on city property. Instead, how can we find compassionate and longer lasting solutions? Don't further penalize the most marginalized among us. We know the work goes on. And simply reflecting on all of this during the weekend, we remember Dr. King, reminds us how much the work has been going for all of our human existence, and we'll keep going. It is our work as people, as creatures, as mortals with opinions and fears and hopes and aspirations. It is holy work. 100 years ago, they were looking at bodily autonomy, class, and the basic needs of food. Sound familiar? In the 1960s and 1970s, they were wrestling with war, living into our morals, the practice of peace. Sound familiar? what we get to do, what we keep getting to do, what helps provide a certain degree, I think, of hope, or my perspective, is how sharing of these stories reminds us that we are all connected and we have so much aspiration and so much possibility within us and around us. And there's just the joy of never knowing where these connections will go and where this will take us. Over 20 years ago, I had the chance to preach at Camp Hill, Alabama, and see the beautiful church that was founded by Mary Slaughter's family. That was built, the beautiful church that exists now was built while she was a child and was full in living memory. And how that fostered her sense of community and action and sent her out into the world. I had no idea that I would be talking about Mary Slaughter Scott today when I first preached at Camp Hill over 20 years ago. I want that conversation with Clinton Lee Scott and with Mary Slaughter Scott about autonomy, about choice, about feeding the people, about economics, about freedom of thought in the world. I want that conversation with Reverend James Wilkes and with the board and the leadership of that time about what this was like to struggle and wrestle and try to protect people from harm, to try to live in peace, and also try to live our values and not squash freedom of expression as well. The work goes on. I invite us to take up the practice, because it is a practice. There's no fixed stopping point in this work. I invite us to take up the work of being a voice and a presence and a beloved community. What a precious thing that we get to do together. Let us go forth. Amen. I invite us to rise in body or spirit to sing our closing hymn, number 295, Sing Out Praises for the Journey.
The Work We Share by Reverend Krista Taves. It is our work, shared with each other in covenant, that creates and sustains this beloved community. We extinguish this chalice, but its light lives on in the directions we have chosen today. The light of this faith lives on in us together, in our hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits. Amen and blessed be.
If here you have found freedom, take it with you into the world. If you have found comfort, go and share it with others. If you have dreamed dreams, help one another that they may come true. And if you have known love, give some back to a bruised and hurting world. Our worship is ended. Let our service begin.